Evening, friends, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues from Stony Brook, friends from the community here in the area. It's a great pleasure for me this evening to introduce you to the Provost Lecture Series. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Provost. So and I have to tell you, this is the Condensa Sanis, and myself and my wife Eleni, who is with us, are delighted to host you this evening for this wonderful event. The Provost Lecture Series is indeed the best interdisciplinary intellectual event that we have on this campus. We have people who come from different walks of life, different intellectual strengths, and typically we have a number of departments, colleges, institutes, centers, disciplines who work together. We have about 6 of those every semester, and I'm truly delighted. I can tell you that the competition is intense to get one of those 6 spots. So I'm truly delighted that we have Perry and his performers to follow for this. So I want to say a few words about Perry, a few words about the lecture, and a few words about the event in general. So first about Perry. Perry is our wonderful chairman of the Department of Music at Stony Brook University, one of the best music departments in the world. Let's give them a hand. Perry has been on the faculty at Stony Brook since 1992. During this time, he has served the department and the community with distinction. I can tell you a few of the tasks he has done. He has been undergraduate program director, graduate program director. He has founded the college, Undergraduate College of Arts, Cultures, and Humanities, which is a big deal. He has received the Chancellor's and President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. And now he is the chair of the Department of Music. But it doesn't stop here. I've been at Stony Brook now for about 2 years, exactly 2 years and 4 weeks today. Wonderful time. And I can tell you that Perry is an astute administrator who I've tapped on for numerous tasks over the last couple of years. For example, he has served on a committee, a very interesting committee, which is chaired by Mark Michaelitis, and I see him down there, on developing a new budget model for the university. And this model needs to work for everybody. It needs to work for the engineers and the scientists and the people in the humanities and the arts. So Perry's on that committee. Perry co-chaired the Disciplinary Faculty Cluster Hiring Committee, which is an arduous task, and we'll talk about it some other time, but it's a great work that he did for the university. And currently he's going to co-chair the search committee for the new dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. This tells you how much confidence I have in Perry's leadership. Let's give him a hand. So I talked about you as an administrator. Now I'm going to talk about you as a music performer and a composer. So Perry is a celebrity. He has written over 50 pieces in a variety of mediums, from the piano to the saxophone to the bass clarinet, all kinds of other things, and he has been praised and lauded by the international press. I'll just read a few of those. He has been called a composer of consummate structural and inventive artistry by CD Spotlight. His works have been described as kinetic, percussive, and pummeling by New York Times, and jazz-paced, abrasive, and ultimately cathartic by the Los Angeles Times. Perry also composed a song cycle on commission from the United States Military Academy Band at West Point that tells the story of the Robert Falcon Scott expedition to the South Pole in 1910. In his lecture, Sent This Diary to My Widow, using photographs from the expedition and playing excerpts from that piece, Perry will discuss his musical setting of this inspiring and ultimately tragic adventure. What I really like about it is that it's truly interdisciplinary within the discipline, because you combine lots of media in this. I'm also delighted to inform you that following the lecture, we're going to go to our main hall of the Great Stoller Center, and there we're going to have the pleasure of listening to 6 songs on Scott's last expedition, which feature faculty soprano Brenda Harris and the Stony Brook Symphony Orchestra. The program will be conducted by Stony Brook alumnus Jeffery Meyer, and will include the Copland Clarinet Concerto and the Brahms Symphony No. 4 in E minor. So I know that this evening will be enjoyable, and I want to thank all of you, and above all, I want to thank Perry and our wonderful students. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Asanis. I got a little nervous. I thought I was about to be put on another committee, but thank you very much. Oh, there you are. I think nobody who knows me would accuse me of being particularly outdoorsy. Nevertheless, tonight's performance is a telling of the story of the Robert Falcon Scott expedition to the South Pole. So I'm going to try to explain why I chose this particular story, given the fact that I've never wanted to test my mettle against the extremities of nature. Let me tell you a little bit about the story, and then I'll tell you why I became interested and a little bit about the process of composing the piece. Robert Falcon Scott was a British naval officer. Looks a little bit like this, who made 2 trips to Antarctica to try to reach the South Pole. This was no mean feat at the time. It had never been reached before, mostly because it was an 800-mile journey back and forth, each way actually, through fierce winds, through temperatures down sometimes to 50 degrees below zero. Scott's second expedition took off from New Zealand in 1910. The ship was called the Terra Nova. And during the expedition, Scott learned that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen was on his way also to discover the South Pole. Amundsen had intended to go to the North Pole. While he was on his way, it had been discovered. So he turned around to come the other way, already equipped, and decided he would race Scott to the pole. Scott knew this, which put a lot of pressure on Scott to try to beat Amundsen to the pole. And that's Amundsen. Scott and his 4 companions, Bertie Bowers, Lawrence Oates, Edgar Evans, and Edward Wilson, made it to the pole, only to discover that Amundsen had beaten them there by 33 days. And here they are seeing the Norwegians' tent at the pole. I'm sure that was not a happy sight for them. And in the tent was a letter to Scott. Well, it was to the King of Norway, but with a note to Scott that said, if we don't make it, please take this package to the King of Norway. As you'll see, that's quite ironic, since Amundsen did indeed make it. Scott, not so much. Dejected, the men headed back. And one of the things that they had to do in this expedition, because they were in part a science expedition, was to carry scientific equipment. So here they are pulling these 200-pound sleds, and this is an 800-mile voyage back to their camp. One of the members, Evans, died presumably of brain damage from falling into crevasses. Oates, frostbitten, was unable to go on, and he asked the men if they would give him the morphine that they would carry so he could take his own life. They refused to do it, so he said, during a blizzard, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." This with a British understatement. And this is a painting made of Oates walking to his death in the blizzard. Scott Bowers and Wilson traveled then to within 186 miles of their base camp, within 11 miles of one of the food depots, and according to Scott, they were confined to their tent for days and could not continue on. So they died in their tents, and their bodies were recovered 8 months later. We came out tonight for a very cheerful subject. My interest in this story developed in the most unarctic circumstances in Deerfield Beach, Florida, in my parents' condominium. I saw a PBS documentary on the Scott expedition, which was, I thought, fascinating, but what really touched me were the letters that Scott wrote to the families of his men while stuck in the tent in those last days as he lay dying. And they were tremendously moving to me. And that must have been 20 years ago. And somehow it stuck in my mind that this would be a great subject someday for a set of songs. In 2004, I had an opportunity to do a second commission for the U.S. military band at West Point. And I remembered this subject and decided that I would try to tackle it and tell the story as best I could. I should mention that we're going to hear some excerpts tonight. They're all from the United States Military Academy Band at West Point's recording, which was made in 2005. The version that you're going to hear tonight was reorchestrated last year just in time for Hurricane Sandy, and it was supposed to be performed, and the Stony Brook Symphony concert was postponed. It seems maybe apt that there was a weather disaster that offset this by a year. I didn't know really what to do about a text, since the text is crucial, so I turned to my good friend Richard Powers. Richard Powers is a celebrated novelist. He's written 11 novels, including The Echo Maker, which won the National Book Award in 2006. I had collaborated with him before, so I wrote him an email. He's very prompt, but I didn't hear from him for a day. I said, I have an opportunity to write a commission for the West Point Band. Would you be interested in writing a set of poems for me? And I didn't hear for a good 24 hours, and when I did hear, he had sent me 5 poems. So he was busy at work, but I had to write back to him and say, well, you know, these are very lovely poems, and I hope I can use them someday. But I really had this story about the Scott expedition to the South Pole in mind, and could you write me up some poems on that? He wrote back, no. He said, that I would love to do that for you, but I'm in the middle of a book, and I really should work on that, and this would take me quite a bit of time to write and a lot of research to do. Sorry, looking for a little water. So I said, that's fine. He said, well, you know, you're a pretty good writer. Why don't you write some poems yourself? I said, okay, I'll take that under advisement. And I immediately started searching around for some real poems or real texts. I found a professor at the University of Tasmania who specialized in Antarctica. And I wrote to her, and she said, oh, yes, I have a lot of poetry on the Scott expedition to the South Pole. I said, well, that's great. Could you send it to me? So a few weeks later, she sent me a package, sheaths of paper, and I excitedly ripped open the box and looked inside and started reading the poems. They were dreadful. Oh, they were dreadful. Very excited about Scott at the Pole, but not very good at telling the story. So I took Rick's suggestion seriously. I will show you Rick. And I started writing my own poems. And he said he would help edit if I took care of the writing of the text or the poems. And so I sent them to him, these 3 poems, and I got a call about 10 minutes later after sending them off. No introduction, no hello, simply a resigned, all right, I'll do it. I'd like to think he was so excited by the quality of my excellent poetry that he wanted in on the action, but I suspect he was trying to spare me any further humiliation. So he wrote well, he didn't write the text. He discovered when he read the diaries of Scott, which amount to almost 500 pages, that they were quite beautiful and descriptive and very sensitive. And so he decided that he would take those 500 pages and reduce them down to 6 texts. And that's what he did over the course of the next month or so. What he needed to do was to tell the story, first of all, to supply images capable of coming to life when set to music, and also to create a story that had a dramatic arc, with periods of relief, however, because as you can tell, this is not a happy story. And I think he did a masterful job. You'll be the judge of that when you hear the text tonight. As far as the composition is concerned, I had a roommate back in college named Bill DeFotis, another composer, who one day offhandedly said Mahler wrote Symphony No. 4 in an urge to compose like Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn, who died 100 years before, approximately 100 years before Mahler did. And I'd say I was probably attracted to this story for some of the same reasons. I was attracted to the old-fashioned sensibilities of the story, the opportunity to write music about heroism, about camaraderie, about patriotism. There's a great deal of humor in Scott's diary. I wanted to write a piece that was free from the usual 20th and now 21st century irony or cynicism. I wanted to write something that was direct and appealing, that was not abstract particularly, and something too that alluded to older styles, which I felt I could do given the fact that Scott was at the pole just about 100 years ago. So the piece you'll hear tonight is tonal. It stretches tonality in certain places, but it's certainly in keys. It contains waltzes, marches. I had a great time writing nautical, what I thought was nautical sounding music. Heroic brass music to accompany the descriptions of the men and their heroic feats. There's also ample opportunity to quote from received music. So, for example, there is a dance hall song in the third music from 1908. Some of you may know it. It's called, not that you were there in 1908, but many people seem to know this tune. It's called She's Got Rings on Her Fingers. Anybody know that? Yeah. And you'll hear that in the third movement. There's a reference in the cycle to God Save the King. You'll hear that too. And the men prayed in the morning, and so there was also ample opportunity to write music in the style of Bach chorales. Since I've been teaching that for so many years, I thought I would give it a shot myself. There's also a wealth of textural images in Rick's choice of the text for the 6 songs. There's the exuberance of the ship leaving dock from New Zealand. There's a near shipwreck. There are great representations of animals in the Zaire itself. Scott describes the penguins, he describes the dogs, the horses. He had great sympathy for the animals, which you'll see alluded to several times during the course of the piece. It was also an opportunity to represent the landscape of Antarctica, which is also, although very forbidding, also very beautiful. So I made a stab at representing brilliant light and the cold of Antarctica. In fact, the piece starts, as you'll hear when I play an excerpt in a moment, in what I think is a suspended state of coldness. And then there's the opposite. There's the warmth and even the coziness of the shelters that they built that Scott refers to, and a picture of which you'll see in just a few minutes. Also an opportunity to represent the men's character. And all these were great fun and very fertile opportunities for a composer trying to make some sense out of the story and to bring it to life. My job, of course, was to convey these images in a persuasive way, to make a story that would hang together, and also to effectively control the drama and the arc of the story. As you can see, as you know now, the story becomes increasingly dramatic and increasingly somber, and to try to figure out how to do that without the audience wanting to take its own life was one of my goals. So I began the piece in June of 2004, and that's actually when the expedition left from New Zealand, not in 2004, but in June. And I worked about 6 months and completed the score in December. And then I was surprised to look up after preparing the parts for all the instruments, to discover that I finished the parts on the day that Scott reached the pole, just by coincidence. I have a contract from the United States Army, which contracts for things like boxes of peas and pillows and compositions. And so my contract says that I would supply a musical composition for voice and band that would last between 15 and 18 minutes. And it seemed pretty clear after I started that it was going to be longer than 15 to 18 minutes. I didn't really want to break the contract, so I wrote to Colonel Thomas Rotundi, who was the commissioning officer and also the conductor. And I said, well, it looks like it's going to be 20 minutes. And he wrote back and he said, well, that's okay. And then I wrote back and said, well, I think it's going to be 25 minutes. And he wrote back and said, well, I think that's okay. And I wrote back and I said, well, Colonel, it looks like it's going to be 30 minutes. And he wrote back and said, well, that's okay. And then I wrote again and said, it's going to be 35 minutes. And he wrote back and said, just write the damn piece, will you, please? So I did, and in fact, the piece you're going to hear tonight is 35 minutes long, 6 movements. And I wanted to show you a representation of the collaboration between Rick, who set the text, and me. After the taking of the photograph, I discovered he was tall, and I was not particularly. So I thought I would say a few words about the formal scheme of the piece. I don't know that people really remember anything before they go in to hear a piece, but I'm going to take a stab at saying what I had in mind and explaining and playing some excerpts from some of the movements. It's in 6 songs, as I mentioned, and they are The Voyage Out, and I'll just say a couple of words about each, and then I'll play some excerpts from it. The Voyage Out was great fun because it describes the departure from New Zealand, which must have been a really festive thing from what Scott writes. Then there's a near shipwreck. And after the shipwreck, Scott very gratefully talks about how the sun came out. And I'm sure that sunlight was very welcome after that. And then he talks about how everybody was pulling on deck and how everybody was there to help each other. It's a real comradely text. The second song is called Land at Last, and it's about reaching Antarctica, and it tells the story of arriving there, of landing the stores, of building a comfortable dwelling place. And if the first song is mostly energetic and robust, the second song is very glowing, and it's kind of a barcarolle. It just sways back and forth. It's quiet. I hope, very lovely. And then the third movement is called Penguins. It's a kind of interlude, and it depicts Scott's delight with the penguins. Now, this is a story very much in need with some comic relief, and so the penguins in the third song are the comic relief. Scott discovered that when the men sang to the little Adelaide penguins, who were very shy but very curious, they would run up to the men, and when they stopped singing, they would run back to the water. So this is a burlesque movement that describes that. The fourth song is also something of a set piece. It doesn't really forward the story, but it contains Scott's observations about the nature of the march and of Antarctica, of walking through that forbidding territory and the dangers that they faced. And then the fifth song takes back up the story. Scott learns that Amundsen is heading to the pole. He describes his heroic men. He describes the morning service as unsuccessful. You can imagine that his morning service might be unsuccessful. And then the fifth song, which is about a third of the length of the entire cycle, 11 minutes long, is the real storytelling part of the cycle. It talks of the men reduced to eating the horses, and if you read Scott's diary, he was so fond of them, and to be in that kind of extremity is very touching. He discovers Amundsen's tent, yet he determines to trek back, and the song describes the death of Evans, then the death of Oates, and then Scott's last thoughts as he's lying in the tent. So I thought it might be fun to hear some of the excerpts to prepare you for what you're about to hear, and I should say again, this is the band version. This is a different orchestration than the one I prepared for tonight's Stony Brook Symphony Orchestra. The first song, The Voyage Out. What I was hoping to do here was 2 things at the very outset. The first was to create this sort of icy sensibility. So you'll hear a run up to very high winds. And I don't mean winds as in winds, I mean wind instruments. But there's also a roiling, a lot of energy, and that energy picks up and up and up and up, and then finally we see the boat come out of the harbor. I'd like to read the first few lines. The ship came out of dock, a scene of great industry. Men were building horse stalls, caulking the decks, resecuring the deck houses. Not a single spot but had its band of workers. The ship pushed off from the jetty, a great mass of people, very gay scene. Pennell swung the ship for compass adjustment, then away. And I'll play the beginning. You'll hear both the setting of the Antarctic theme and then also this energy that you'll then hear turn into a vamp for the singer before she says, the ship came out of dock. Now the ship comes out of dock. As I said, I had a little guilty pleasure in writing what I thought sounded like nautical music. You can decide whether it does yourself. But here is the ship, and the nautical music, which occurs in a couple of places in the movement, sounds like this. And this is a scene, I guess, on deck after the shipwreck, and I mean the near shipwreck. Scott's very upset because they've lost a pony. Pony died, and he's afraid a couple of other ponies will die. And in the midst of all this, the sun appears. And so I tried to write something like relieved sun music. And also, in the midst of all this energy, it seemed like a good idea. There are many pieces that have a kind of ABA form, where the A and the B section are contrasting, and so this is the B music. Oops, that's not the B music. The sun has appeared through breaks in the cloudy heavens. Brilliantly illuminating some field of pack. Some steep-walled berg. Some patch of bluest sea. So sunlight and shadow have chased each other across our scene. Really lovely writing from Scott, as is typical of his diary. Land at Last, the second song, is finally they get to Antarctica. There are a couple of... By the way, these photographs were taken by the ship's photographer, whose name was Herbert Ponting, and they're really very beautiful. They reach Antarctica. And what I chose to use as a setting is a kind of gently swaying barcarolle, a 6/8 time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Very cozy kind of music, I think, because Scott writes, "After many frowns, fortune has treated us to the kindest smile, a solid wharf on which to land our stores, the golden light on the scene of mountain and ice." Just start with that. These are antiphonal vibraphones. You'll see them on each side of the stage, answering each other. And the bass clarinet comes in with a low introduction. And then the winds join antiphonally, answering each other. After many frowns, fortune has favored us with the kindest smile. A solid wharf on which to land our stores, the golden light on the scene of mountain and ice, in the next lines. Then in one of the many, many references to the animals on the expedition, Scott writes about the horses. He says, "The landing, a week's work, after the sledges came the ponies, poor brutes, how glad they must be to scratch themselves." And there's a kind of slow pulling music that recurs to represent the horses. There are leitmotifs throughout the piece. This is one of them. It's a kind of do-dee-dum, a very heavy kind of work tune. And here are the horses. They might be scratching themselves. And here's the music that accompanies them throughout. How glad they must be to scratch themselves. A message came from the ship to say that all the stores had been landed. Nothing remains but mutton, books, pictures, and the pianola. They had the good sense to bring a little piano on the ship. And then Scott writes, and I show this because it looks a little like my study. The hut is becoming the most comfortable dwelling place imaginable. We have made unto ourselves a truly seductive home, within the walls of which peace, quiet, and comfort reign supreme. And you hear there's a return to the opening music at the end, and that's the case in all of the first 5 songs. Some modification. Third movement, Penguins. It's mostly a comical song, but it starts out and ends with some not very comical music. In fact, I think fairly forbidding music, which has to do with what the penguins observe at the very end. Wilson went over the floe to capture some penguins. We saw the birds run up to him, then rush away again. He says most comical and interesting. They will always come up at a trot when we sing to them. Explorers singing at the top of their voices to admiring penguins. Well, she's got bells on her fingers and rings on her toes. Scott got it wrong in the diary. She's got rings on her fingers and bells on her toes. Scott writes she's got bells on her fingers and rings on her toes. Elephants to ride upon wherever she goes. So come to your nabob and next Patrick Day. Be Mr. Mumbo Jumbo Jijaboo Jay. That's the lyric from the 1908 song. So I shamelessly stole from that. This is the opening. And now the penguin music. So that comes through the entire song. Rush up to him and rush away. Now, they really enjoyed the men singing, except for poor Cecil Mears. It's a Cecil Mears. Mears is the greatest attraction, Scott writes. A full voice which is musical, but always very flat. He declares that God save the king will always send them back to the water. So, and I chose to set this, you'll hear under the soprano part, which is not God Save the King, the brass playing God Save the King, and a sudden modulation at the end to represent flatness. So. Oops. So there they are running back to the water. And here's why the music at the beginning and end is a little sinister. They waddle forward, poking their heads to and fro in their odd way. In spite of a string of howling dogs straining to get at them, hello, they seem to say, here's a game. What do all you ridiculous things want? Oh, that's the sort of animal you are. Well, you've come to the wrong place. I think you must have a text there, is that right? Good. So here's the you've come to the wrong place, and the sinister music at the end, and then just a little hint of the waddling of the penguins to end the song. The fourth song, I see you have the text, so I'll quickly read with you. Scott observes the hardening process must be good for animals, though not for men. Strings of ponies progressing over the ice, following in each other's tracks. The dogs are tired tonight, pathetic to see the ponies floundering. The small green tent and the great white road, the whine of a dog and the neigh of our steeds, the driving cloud of powdered snow. The crunch of footsteps which break the surface crust, the gentle flutter of our canvas shelter, its deep booming under the force of a blizzard. The eternal silence of the great white desert, the vast silence broken only by the mellow sounds of the marching column. So you can see Rick, very happily for me, put a blizzard in the middle of this rather dour text. It's a chance to write more exciting music, perhaps. This is the pony floundering music. It's a funeral march. So I thought to channel Gustav Mahler, as my friend Bill DeFotis said, Mahler was channeling Haydn. I was channeling Mahler. This is a very Mahlerian kind of funeral march, and you'll hear shifts from the major to the minor mode on the same chords, very typical of Mahler, and also the beginning of more and more disturbing music, techniques that are somewhat disorienting in these fourth, fifth, and sixth songs. I thought I would play the blizzard music because, again, you're looking for opportunities as things get worse and worse to liven things up for a moment and to be somewhat dramatic. And this blizzard gave me a chance to write some exciting blizzard music. That's not a blizzard from Scott's expedition. That's a generic blizzard up there. The fifth song continues the story. One of the things I did, as I mentioned, progressively is to create more and more disturbances. In this particular song, the beginning is in 2 different meters, that is 2 different times at once. So the bassoons are going to go dee-dee-dum, da-dee-dum at that tempo. You'll hear when the oboe comes in, it comes in at this tempo. 1, 2, 3. So you'll have these contradictory tempos, which are one of the things that I try to do to create increasing disorientation in the music. This is the opening. That's a pair of bassoons at this tempo with marimba. Now the oboe. You hear that they're slightly off? That's intentional. Anything that sounds off in this piece is intentional. Then the opportunity that Rick provided to write some heroic music as things are getting worse and worse. So Scott wrote these words about the men. Wilson with all ready and willing, Evans with a clear-minded zeal. Bowers is the hardest traveler that ever took a polar journey. Oates' whole heart is in the ponies, boys, all of them, but such good-natured ones. No friction at all. I do not think that harder men or better travelers ever took the trail. And so this is a chance to write full-out heroic music, brass blazing. So as you can tell, as the story becomes more and more desperate, these opportunities to write something that would break the gloom of the decrescendo toward the end was welcome, as was this. The men prayed in the mornings, and Scott writes, held the usual morning service. This is great British understatement. Hymns not quite successful today, right? Which I said as hymns not quite successful, not successful today. And here's where I had a chance to write a chorale in the style of Johann Sebastian Bach. So you hear the tune, which is my tune, and it's accompanied by low brass. Who is man and what his place in the recklessness of space? What has he, this atom creature, in the infinitude of nature? Oops. And then there's a little coda. And that brings us to the sixth song. Here you'll find the techniques of disorientation are much more pronounced. In fact, you'll hear quick excerpts from 4 of the previous 5 songs, now put to new purposes. Music is in different tempos. The phrases don't end at the same time. Music is in different keys simultaneously. And at the very end, there's a tolling of bells and a cessation of all activity. The same chord is tolled for many, many, many measures. I'll play a little of this for you. I'd rather you hear it in its entirety. But as you can imagine, Scott, who was so solicitous of the animals up to this point, when he speaks of killing the ponies for meat when they're starving, it needed to be a dramatic effect. And that's the blizzard music from the previous song. In fact, there are a lot of references to the previous songs, and now in different contexts. The Bach chorale comes back, but faster and in simultaneous keys. Here he says, "The worst has happened, a flag near the remains of a camp. The Norwegians are first at the pole." And then he permits himself one of the very few moments of anguish in the entire diaries. He says, "Great God, this is an awful place." And when he finishes that observation, or at least the way Rick saw fit to juxtapose the text, he says, "Well, we have turned our back on ambition and must face 800 miles of solid dragging," always ready to do his duty to the end. Great God, this is an awful place. Evans dies next, as you'll hear. Here's Scott bucking up. We must face 800 miles of solid dragging. And now the horse's leitmotif, that dragging leitmotif, is now the men dragging the sleds. Evans dies quietly, and then Scott observes, "Beautiful day, too beautiful," he writes. The climax of the piece is when Oates dies. As I mentioned already, Oates, very badly frostbitten and wanting to commit suicide, walks out into the blizzard and says, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." And the chorale, you'll hear, if you listen carefully, you'll hear the chorale from the fifth movement, that very lovely Bach chorale turned into something of a almost vaudeville climax. cannot help each other, can only say, God help us, and plod on our weary way. I think I won't play anymore. You'll hear later how it all ends. But Scott writes, while dying in his tent, "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart. Our dead bodies must tell the tale. Surely a great rich country like ours will see that those who depended on us are properly provided for." And he signed his name. On the diary itself, he wrote, "Send this diary to my wife." And then as he lay dying, he crossed out wife and wrote widow. He writes, "It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people." Now, lest you be too crestfallen by the results, I want to make one final comment about Scott, and that is that throughout whatever privations he experienced, and there was a lot of literature written after, the heroic literature written that seemed to paint him as something of a foolish planner for planning this expedition the way he did. But he wrote in a message to the public in those last days, "We are weak, writing is difficult, but for my own sake, I do not regret this journey, which has shown that Englishmen can endure hardships, help one another, and meet death with as great a fortitude as ever in the past. We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last." I hope you enjoy it tonight. Thank you.